When an avoidant and an empath both go no contact, what happens next is something neither of them saw coming. And if you've ever been in this exact dynamic, if you've ever loved someone who kept pulling away every time you got close, or if you've ever been the one doing the pulling away, while some part of you quietly hoped they'd chase you anyway, then what I'm about to walk you through is going to feel less like psychology and more like someone finally reading the diary you never wrote. Because this particular combination, an avoidant and an empath, is not just a relationship. It's a psychological collision between two completely opposite wound systems trying to find safety in the only ways they each know how. And when both of them go silent at the same time, when both of them choose no contact simultaneously, what unfolds is one of the most fascinating, most painful, most misunderstood emotional sequences in all of relationship psychology. Stay with me. This is going to go deeper than you're expecting. Let's establish something first, because you cannot understand what happens when they both go quiet without understanding what was actually happening when they were still talking. The empath and the avoidant don't just attract each other by accident. This is not random chemistry. This is wound recognition at a level so deep that neither person is consciously aware it's happening. The empath, someone who feels everything, who leads with emotional depth, who has an almost compulsive need to understand and be understood, is magnetically drawn to emotional unavailability, not because she's masochistic, but because emotional unavailability is a puzzle, and empaths are wired to solve people. The avoidant, on the other hand, is someone who learned somewhere early in life that closeness comes with a cost, that needing people leads to disappointment, that vulnerability is exposure, that love and loss are essentially the same package deal delivered at different times. And so the avoidant learned to keep distance not because they don't feel, but because they feel so much that closeness became terrifying. Put these two people in the same room, and the pull between them is almost gravitational. The empath senses the depth underneath the avoidant's walls and moves toward it. The avoidant senses the safety of the empath's acceptance and, for a moment, maybe even lets her in. And that moment, that brief, extraordinary window where the avoidant opens and the empath pours in, is the most intoxicating thing either of them has ever felt. Which is exactly what makes what comes next so devastating. Because the avoidant always closes back up. It's not cruelty, it's not manipulation, even though it can feel like both. It's a nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do: detect emotional closeness crossing a certain threshold and retreat before the inevitable pain arrives. The empath feels this withdrawal like a physical thing, like warmth being pulled from a room. And instead of retreating herself, she typically does the opposite. She moves closer, she tries harder, she over-explains, over-gives, overstays, convinced that if she can just find the right combination of patience and love and presence, the wall will come down permanently this time. It won't. Not because the avoidant doesn't care, but because the empath's pursuit is actually triggering the exact same fear response that caused the retreat in the first place. In attachment theory, this is called the pursuer-distancer dynamic. The more the empath pursues, the more the avoidant distances. And the more the avoidant distances, the more the empath pursues. They are not communicating. They are triggering each other's deepest wounds in an endless, exhausting loop that both of them privately wonder if they'll ever escape. And then one day, sometimes after weeks, sometimes after years, sometimes after a specific conversation that finally breaks something open, the empath decides she's done. She goes no contact. Not necessarily because she's stopped loving him, often because she's finally run out of the energy required to keep loving someone who keeps making her feel like loving them is wrong. And this is the moment everything shifts, because no contact from an empath is not the same as no contact from most people. When an empath goes quiet, it's not a game. It's not a tactic designed to make someone chase her, even though the world will tell her it should be. When an empath goes no contact, it means she has finally, painfully, chosen herself over the hope of him. And that choice cost her more than most people will ever understand. Because empaths don't give up on people easily. They give up on people only after they've exhausted every possible version of, maybe if I just try this differently. So when she finally goes silent, something has genuinely ended inside her. Not the love, necessarily, but the willingness to keep bleeding for someone who keeps handing her the knife with a look of genuine confusion. Now, here's where it gets psychologically extraordinary. Because simultaneously, sometimes in response to her silence, sometimes completely independently, the avoidant also goes no contact. Maybe he was already pulling away before she did. Maybe her sudden silence triggered something he didn't expect. Maybe he told himself it was fine, that space was what he wanted, that this was actually a relief. And for approximately the first 72 hours, he might even believe that. The avoidant is genuinely good at convincing himself that distance is freedom, that the quiet is peace, that he's finally breathing again without the weight of someone else's emotional needs pressing against his chest. He checks his phone and doesn't text her. He goes about his day. He thinks, maybe this is better. Maybe this is what I needed. And then, somewhere around day 4 or 5, something starts shifting under the surface that he doesn't have language for yet. Something his nervous system notices before his conscious mind does. The silence he thought was relief starts feeling different, starts feeling like absence. And absence, for an avoidant who lets someone in, even partially, hits very differently than he anticipated. This is the part nobody tells you about avoidance. The deactivation, the retreat, the walls, the emotional shutdown. All of it is a learned response to anticipated pain. But here's the thing about walls. They don't just keep people out, they also keep everything in. And when the threat of closeness is removed, when the empath is no longer there, no longer pursuing, no longer giving him something to pull away from, the avoidant suddenly has nothing to push against. And without something to push against, the feelings that the pushing was covering start rising to the surface with absolutely nowhere to go. He doesn't miss her the way the empath would miss someone. He doesn't process it in waves of emotion he can identify and name and work through. He experiences it more like a low-grade wrongness, a background discomfort he can't locate the source of, an unease in his body that his mind keeps trying to rationalize away. He might get irritable for no clear reason. He might throw himself into work, or the gym, or anything that creates forward motion, because forward motion has always been easier than sitting still with something that hurts. But the unease stays. Because she was the one person who actually saw him, who didn't run from his complexity, who stayed even when he made staying difficult. And now she's gone. And something in him, something very deep and very old, recognizes that loss, even while the rest of him is still pretending it's a choice. Meanwhile, the empath is having her own completely different but equally complex experience in the silence. Because choosing no contact doesn't silence the feelings, not for an empath. If anything, it amplifies them, because now there's no interaction to analyze, no text to overread, no conversation to replay, looking for the moment everything went sideways. There's just the quiet. And in the quiet, the empath's nervous system, accustomed to being constantly oriented toward him. What is he feeling? What does he need? Is he okay? Why did he say it like that? What did that silence mean? Suddenly has nothing to lock onto. And that disorientation, that sudden removal of the emotional object she'd been orbiting, feels less like freedom and more like vertigo. She knows she made the right choice. She knows her peace depends on this silence. She knows if she breaks it now, she's going back to the same cycle that wore her down to nothing. She knows all of this in her mind clearly, rationally, completely. And then she picks up her phone at 11 at night and has to physically put it in another room because she knows herself well enough to know she's 30 seconds from undoing everything she just built. What happens next, inside both of them, between both of them, and to both of them, is the part of this dynamic that almost nobody talks about honestly. Because no contact doesn't end the relationship between an avoidant and an empath. In some ways, it begins the most important chapter of it. And that chapter is exactly where we're going next. No contact doesn't end the relationship between an avoidant and an empath. It just moves it inward. And what happens inward, in both of them, simultaneously, in the same silence, is where the real story begins. Because this is the part that determines everything. Whether they come back together and break the cycle, or come back together and repeat it. Whether the silence heals them or just delays the next collision. Whether this is the ending or the beginning of something neither of them has experienced before. And the answer to all of that depends entirely on what each of them does with the silence while they're still in it. Let's stay with the avoidant first, because what happens inside him during no contact is genuinely one of the most misunderstood psychological processes in relationship dynamics. Everyone assumes the avoidant is fine. Everyone assumes the silence is comfortable for him, natural even, a return to the baseline he was always more at home in. And in the beginning, as we talked about, he tells himself that too. But somewhere between week 1 and week 3, something starts happening that the avoidant almost never anticipates, because his entire psychological architecture is built around not needing people, around being self-sufficient, around the quiet pride of not falling apart when connection disappears. What starts happening is this: he starts remembering her in the wrong moments. Not in the moments he'd expect, not in the big, obvious ones, like the places they used to go together, or the songs that soundtracked whatever they had. He starts remembering her in the small moments, the forgettable ones that somehow didn't get forgotten. The way she'd say something and then immediately watch his face to see how it landed. The way she'd sit in silence with him without needing to fill it, which was the thing he said he always wanted, and yet somehow, now that it's the only option, the silence feels entirely different without her in it. These small memories arrive with a weight he wasn't prepared for. And the avoidant, who has never developed a strong muscle for sitting with emotional discomfort, does what he always does. He pushes it down, stays busy, tells himself it'll pass. But it doesn't pass. It accumulates. Because the empath wasn't just a person in his life. She was the one person who made him feel, even briefly, even imperfectly, that being fully known by someone didn't have to end in devastation. And now that she's gone, he's back to being fully unknown, which used to feel like safety, and suddenly, for the first time, doesn't feel like safety at all. Meanwhile, the empath is going through something that looks completely different from the outside, but is equally disorienting from the inside. Because here's what nobody tells empaths about the no-contact period: it doesn't feel like power. At least, not immediately. The world treats no contact like a victory lap, like the empath has finally taken back control. And in one sense, she has. But the experience of it, especially in the first few weeks, feels less like a victory and more like withdrawal. Because she wasn't just attached to him as a person. She was attached to the emotional project of him, the understanding she was trying to build, the connection she could feel underneath the surface that kept convincing her it was real. The version of him she'd seen in those brief windows when his walls came down and something extraordinary looked back at her. She doesn't just miss him. She misses the possibility of him. She misses the version of this story where it worked. And the empath brain, wired for empathy, wired to see the best in people and the most in situations, keeps generating alternative timelines, keeps asking what if, keeps replaying the moments that felt real and asking whether she gave up too soon. This is the specific torture of being an empath in no contact. You cannot stop understanding him, even in his absence. You cannot stop feeling his side of the story, even while you're trying to protect yourself from it. You feel the whole thing, from both angles, all the time, and you have to choose yourself anyway. That takes a kind of strength that looks nothing like strength from the outside, and feels nothing like it from the inside either. Now here's where it gets truly fascinating. And this is the part that separates the dynamics that eventually break the cycle from the ones that just keep repeating it. Somewhere in the no contact period, usually at different times for each of them, but almost always within the same general window, both the avoidant and the empath arrive at the same terrifying question from completely opposite directions. The empath arrives at it after weeks of finally being in her own silence, finally hearing her own thoughts without the noise of managing him, finally starting to feel the edges of herself again after months or years of being blurred by proximity to his emotional unavailability. Her question is this: was I drawn to him because he was right for me, or because his unavailability felt familiar? Because the deepest, most uncomfortable truth about empaths in avoidant relationships is that the chase, exhausting and painful as it was also in some way comfortable. Not comfortable like peace, comfortable like recognition. Like something the nervous system already knew the shape of, probably from very early. Probably from the first person who ever made her feel like love was something you had to earn through enough patience and enough giving and enough staying. And if the empath can sit in that question honestly, without flinching, without immediately reassuring herself that it was just love and love is complicated and she was just trying hard, if she can actually look at that question directly, something starts to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the foundation of why she keeps ending up here starts to become visible in a way it never was when she was too busy chasing him to look. The avoidant arrives at the same crossroads from the opposite direction. His question, when it finally surfaces through all the productivity and distraction and self-sufficient routines, is this: did I push her away because she was wrong for me, or because she was close enough to scare me? Because avoidants are extraordinarily good at generating rational explanations for emotional withdrawals. She was too intense. She needed too much. It just wasn't the right timing. He can build a compelling case for why the distance was logical, and that case will hold up perfectly until he's alone enough, and quiet enough, and honest enough to ask whether the logic was ever really the point. Whether the timing excuse, and the intensity excuse, and every other excuse was just his nervous system protecting him from the thing it fears most. Not her specifically, but what she represented. The terrifying possibility that someone could actually know him and not leave. Because the avoidant doesn't fear closeness the way it looks from the outside, he doesn't fear being smothered or losing his independence. What he actually fears, at the deepest level, is being truly seen and then abandoned anyway. Which is exactly why he abandons first. It's a preemptive strike against a pain his body is certain is coming, because at some point in his past, that pain arrived, and he decided the safest thing was to never be that exposed again. So here are two people sitting in the same silence, asking versions of the same question, arriving at the edges of the same root wound from completely different angles. And what happens next depends almost entirely on whether either of them, or both of them, can do the thing that their respective attachment styles have spent a lifetime helping them avoid. The empath has to stop. Stop chasing, stop analyzing, stop trying to understand him, and start trying to understand herself. She has to sit in her own discomfort without immediately redirecting it towards someone else's emotional experience. She has to learn what it feels like to be in her own nervous system without it being oriented entirely around another person. And the avoidant has to open, has to let the discomfort of her absence be felt instead of managed, has to resist the urge to reframe the loss as a preference, has to allow himself to want something, and then, and this is the part that will cost him the most, has to admit that wanting something doesn't automatically mean losing it. If both of them do this work, genuinely, not performatively, not as a strategy to eventually get back together, but as a real reckoning with the patterns that brought them here, something remarkable becomes possible. Not necessarily a reunion, not necessarily the relationship picking up where it left off, but something rarer and more valuable. Two people who finally understand what they were actually doing to each other, and more importantly, what they were doing to themselves. And from that understanding, whatever comes next, whether it's finding their way back or finding their way forward separately, at least it's chosen, consciously, with eyes open, instead of the half-awake, wound-driven pull that brought them together in the first place. Because the truth about an avoidant and an empath, both going no contact, is this: the silence was never really about the other person. It was always about what they could finally hear when the noise of each other stopped.